Very good. Okay, welcome back, everyone. And since many folks have not yet gotten their first paper back, we decided to push back the due date of the next paper 2 weeks. So instead of next week, it will be the week after that. And I apologize for slowness in getting things back to you. And if you have not received your paper, let me know so that I can make sure we have it in the system and that you get it back expeditiously. Okay, so last time I was talking about the Adams administration, the Alien and Sedition Acts, and I seem to recall ending with the election of 1800. Very complicated, confusing election, and winds up in the House of Representatives, where the Federalists vote for Aaron Burr and the Republicans vote for Jefferson. And just so you know, there were about 100 members of the House of Representatives. 52 of them voted for Aaron Burr to be president. 48 voted for Jefferson. But because each state has one vote, this meant that ultimately 10 states vote for Jefferson and 6 for Burr. So you have a very complicated story as the Federalists in the House of Representatives attempt to block the election of Jefferson, thinking that Burr would be a more amenable person for them to deal with than Jefferson. Well, they thought Jefferson was this ideologue, a visionary theorist. And incidentally, there was a point when anyone who was a visionary was a bad thing to be in politics, as was a theorist. It meant you were divorced from reality. And the French were French still are fond of theory. And this, in the 1790s, was what led them astray, according to folks like, well, the Federalists here, as well as the folks who were losing their heads in France, this attachment to theory. So being a visionary and a theorist were bad things in politics then. I don't know if they still are. I don't know. We'll leave that discussion for another day. So they attempted to block Jefferson's election, and there was some fear that they might do more to prevent his inauguration on March 4th. Remember, they're not just thinking, our policies are going to be scrapped. They really think this is the end of the American existence, as Jefferson was such a disciple of the French Revolution. He would ally the United States with France. In fact, on the morning of March 3rd, John Marshall, about whom we will speak in a bit, wrote a letter to someone in South Carolina saying that the Democrats, and by Democrats he meant the Republicans, and again, if you were a Federalist in 1800, 1801, Democrat was a very bad thing. The Democrats are divided between speculative theorists and absolute terrorists. I think we all know, I don't need to explain terrorists are bad things, but speculative theorists, absolute terrorists. With the latter, he said, I am not inclined to place Mr. Jefferson, but he had his doubts. Jefferson and Marshall actually were cousins. They were distantly related. They really hated each other, too. It's an extraordinary story of these two. I don't mean to personalize everything, but they really clashed almost constantly. And here, Marshall's writing this as he is about to go and administer the oath of office to Jefferson to be President of the United States. And later on in the day, actually I'll get back to this in a bit, Jefferson also was writing a bit during this time when he knows he is going to become president. He actually wrote to just about everyone who had been involved in 1776, in that momentous decision. And he referred to his election as a revolution. The revolution of 1800. He wasn't being grandiose, since this is an historic moment, but he saw this as a returning. Remember, he was a great man of science and thought about the revolutions of celestial bodies, that they return to an original point. So he thought that the country in the 1790s had gotten away from the ideals of 1776, and that this was a returning to the principles that had inspired the revolution. So he wrote to Samuel Adams at the end of the month, I addressed a letter to you my very dear and ancient friend, on the 4th of March, not indeed to you by name, but through the medium of an address to my fellow citizens, whom occasion called on me to address. In meditating the matter of that address, I often asked myself, is this exactly the spirit of the patriarch Samuel Adams? Will he approve of it? To John Dickinson, whom you'll recall as the author of the Farmer's Letters of 1768, as well as the Articles of Confederation, he wrote, "The tough sides of our argosy have been thoroughly tried. Her strength has stood the waves into which she was steered with a view to sink her." Well, he thinks the people who were steering our argosy really were on the wrong track. "We shall put her on her Republican tack, and she will show by the beauty of her motion the skill of her builders." It's a great image, the Constitution as this argosy in which we're sailing in this turbulent sea. And so it's important not to underestimate the importance of this moment. I apologize for using the word important twice in the same sentence. It was an extraordinary moment. The first time, I believe, in the history of the world that an elected government was turned out of office by a popular election, and these folks who were turned out left, replaced by someone else. It's a momentous change. And Jefferson was conscious of this, as were the Federalists. And there was some fear that it would not come off, that somehow the Federalist Party, which had created a standing army, a navy, had expanded the scope of the federal government and believed that their opponents not merely were misguided, but were absolutely dangerous and were going to ruin the country, would hold on to power to prevent that from happening. So the governors of Pennsylvania and Maryland had the militias ready in case there was some trick to prevent the inauguration of Jefferson on March the 4th. But it doesn't happen. And on the morning of March 4th, Jefferson walked to the Capitol building, very conscious of how he is getting to the Capitol building. Adams, you'll recall, had a carriage and was intent, for good reason, on promoting the dignity of the office. And you'll recall he had wanted to have elaborate titles for for the president and other officials. And Jefferson realizes that's not what a Republican executive should do. So he walks from his boarding house to the Capitol building and takes the oath of office from John Marshall, who has just become Chief Justice. And then he delivers perhaps the greatest inaugural address in the history of the Republic. Now, does anyone here remember an inaugural address you have heard? Yes?
Well, I mean, not personally, but you remember some lines from Kennedy's.
Okay, Kennedy's. So that was, nearly 50 years ago. And if I threw out someone who has been president since, could you call up a line? I didn't mean to put you on the spot. Building a bridge to the 21st century, yeah. Much better line than I did not have sex with that woman, I think. So, yeah. So I'm glad you remembered that one. And I apologize for any others. It's not that they don't try. They spend a lot of time trying to craft something, but it's a difficult thing to do. Happily, I'll never be called upon to do it. So anyone else remember something? I didn't mean to have you the voice of... You what? Excuse me? Lincoln. Okay, so now we have to go back to 1864 or 1865. Yeah, and I think, okay, Kennedy and Lincoln I would put in the same category as memorable ones. Any others? What did he say? We must pick ourselves up. Okay, good. I mean, I don't mean to bash that as rhetoric, but I think another important thing about an inaugural address, it can be a great speech, but it really is defined by what comes after. And so the real power of Kennedy's, Roosevelt's, Lincoln's, and Jefferson's is the administration they then created, and the jury is still out on the current president and how he will live up to the inaugural address. So, remember the context of 1800, 1801. There had been this period that Jefferson called the Reign of the Witches, when it had been a federal offense to criticize the president or a member of Congress. The Adams administration had created an army. And then we had probably, well, one of the most extraordinarily bitter presidential elections in history. Terrible things said about different candidates, which we don't need to get into. And so Jefferson's inaugural address, I'm going to actually spend a good deal of time on this because it's a very important speech. Important to remember as well, Jefferson was a terrible public speaker. So very few of the members of Congress assembled actually could hear this. During the contest of opinion through which we have passed, the animation of discussions and of exertions has sometimes worn an aspect which might impose on strangers, unused to think freely and to speak and to write what they think. But this being now decided by the voice of the nation, announced according to the rules of the Constitution, all will, of course, arrange themselves under the will of the law and unite in common efforts for the common good. All, too, will bear in mind this sacred principle, that though the will of the majority is in all cases to prevail, that will, to be rightful, must be reasonable, that the minority possess their equal rights, which equal law must protect, and to violate would be oppression. Let us then, fellow citizens, unite with one heart and one mind. And let us reflect, let us restore to social intercourse that harmony and affection without which liberty and even life itself are but dreary things. And let us reflect that having banished from our land that religious intolerance under which mankind so long bled and suffered, we have gained little if we countenance a political intolerance as despotic, as wicked, and capable of as bitter and bloody persecutions. This is an extraordinary passage. This contest of opinion, we have been divided, but let us now unite with one heart and one mind. The majority in all cases prevails, the minority have their equal rights, and to violate that would be oppression. And having banished religious intolerance, let's not institute political intolerance. During the throes and convulsions of the ancient world, during the agonizing spasms of infuriated man seeking through blood and slaughter his long-lost liberty, he's talking about the French Revolution, it was not wonderful that the agitation of the billows should reach even this distant and peaceful shore, that this should be more felt and feared by some and less by others, and should divide opinions as to measures of safety. But every difference of opinion is not a difference of principle. We have called by different names brethren of the same principle. We are all Republicans. We are all Federalists. If there be any among us who would wish to dissolve this union or to change its Republican form, remember, the Federalists insisted the Republicans want to dissolve the Union. The Republicans insisted the Federalists want to scrap a Republican system and set up a monarchy. So, if there be any among us who would wish to dissolve this Union or to alter its Republican form, let them stand undisturbed as monuments of the safety with which error of opinion may be tolerated where reason is left free to combat it. I know indeed that some honest men fear that a Republican government cannot be strong, that this government is not strong enough. But would the honest patriot, in the full tide of successful experiment, abandon a government which has so far kept us free and firm on the theoretic and visionary fear that this government, the world's best hope, may by possibility want energy to preserve itself? I trust not. I believe this, on the contrary, the strongest government on earth. I believe it is the only one where every man at the call of the law would fly to the standard of the law and would meet violations of the public order as his own personal concern. Sometimes it is said that man cannot be trusted with the government of himself. Can he then be trusted with the government of others? Or have we found angels in the form of kings to govern him? Let history answer this question. And then he goes on to talk about what he will do, what his administration will do. Let me see if I can find this for you. It's an extraordinary passage on the basic fundamental theory of government, that, and also calling those who now say it's ruined because Jefferson's in power. They are the theoretic visionaries. They're going to flee from this, abandon this government, which he calls the world's best hope. And incidentally, there are two ringing phrases in this speech that are often attributed to other people. One is the world's best hope, which Lincoln used to great effect, and the other we'll get to in a bit. But also that passage, what makes a government strong? It isn't having an army, a sedition law. It is having every citizen flying to the standard of the law and meeting violations of the public order as his own personal concern. Okay. The Federalists, incidentally, some of them thought it was amusing that Jefferson talked about having restoring harmony to public intercourse and so on. He was a great wordsmith. Okay. Now, let us then, with courage and confidence, pursue our own federal and Republican principles, our attachment to union and representative government. Kindly separated by nature and a wide ocean from the exterminating havoc of a quarter of the globe, too high-minded to endure the degradations of the others, possessing a chosen country with room enough for our descendants to the thousandth generation. Remember, the country stops at the Mississippi River, okay? Entertaining a due sense of our equal right to the use of our own faculties, to the acquisitions of our own industry, to honor and confidence from our fellow citizens resulting not from birth, but from our actions and their sense of them. Enlightened by a benign religion, professed indeed and practiced in various forms, yet all of them inculcating honesty, truth, temperance, gratitude, and the love of man, acknowledging and adoring an overruling providence, which by all its dispensations proves that it delights in the happiness of man here and his greater happiness hereafter. With all these blessings, this is an extraordinary list of blessings the Americans enjoy, with all these blessings, what more is necessary to make us a happy and a prosperous people? Still one thing more, fellow citizens, a wise and frugal government, which shall restrain men from injuring one another, but otherwise leave them free to regulate their own pursuits of industry and improvement, and shall not take from the mouth of labor the bread it has earned. This is the sum of good government, and this is necessary to close the circle of our felicities. About to enter, fellow citizens, on the exercise of duties which comprehend everything dear and valuable to you, it is proper you should understand what I deem the essential principles of our government, and consequently those which ought to shape its administration. I will compress them within the narrowest compass they will bear, stating the general principle but not all its limitations. Equal and exact justice to all men of whatever state or persuasion, religious or political. Peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none. The support of the state governments in all their rights as the most competent administrations for our domestic concerns and the surest bulwarks against anti-republican tendencies. The preservation of the general government in its whole constitutional vigor as the sheet anchor of our peace at home and safety abroad. A jealous care of the right of election by the people, a mild and safe corrective of abuses which are lopped by the sword of revolution where peaceable remedies are unprovided. Absolute acquiescence in the decisions of the majority, the vital principle of republics, from which is no appeal but to force, the vital principle and immediate parent of despotism. A well-disciplined militia, our best reliance in peace and for the first moments of war till regulars may relieve them. The supremacy of the civil over the military authority. Economy in the public expense, that labor may be lightly burdened. The honest payment of our debts, sacred preservation of the public faith, encouragement of agriculture and of commerce as its handmaid, the diffusion of information and arraignment of all abuses at the bar of public reason, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, and freedom of person under protection of habeas corpus, and trial by juries impartially selected. These principles form the bright constellation which has gone before us and guided our steps through an age of revolution and reformation. The wisdom of our sages and blood of our heroes have been devoted to their attainment. They should be the creed of our public faith, the text of civic instruction, the touchstone by which to try the services of those we trust. And should we wander from them in moments of error or of alarm, let us hasten to retrace our steps and to regain the road which alone leads to peace, liberty, and safety. So what is Jefferson proposing as president? Limited government, okay. That comes through pretty clearly. And the purpose of this is quite simple. Any other thoughts on what he's proposing?
More than what's equal rights.
Yeah. Yeah, equal rights, equal protection under the law, trial, but these are, yes. Yeah, a strict construction of the Constitution, a strict interpretation of it. This is why he writes to Dickinson about putting the ship of state on her Republican tack and showing by the grace of her movements the skill of her builders. Now, the big problem for Jefferson here, as he took office, I expect the biggest problem he saw was the federal budget, the federal debt of now about $50-some-odd million, and an expanding debt. In fact, in 1799, the federal budget had been $6 million. In 1800, it was $3 million. And Jefferson wanted to cut this. Remember the 1798-99, there's a war. The Adams administration builds a navy. The Adams administration does other things to expand the size of the federal government, and all of this has to go. And the end is a simple, frugal government so that labor may be lightly burdened. Jefferson wants to do, the essential thing he wants to do is eliminate the federal debt, because he realizes a debt is a tax that one generation levies on the next, and he thinks it's immoral to do that. He had a great letter to Madison asking if one generation could bind another and all others in succession forever. That is, if we incur a debt on our children, that doesn't leave them free to pursue their own whatever it is they want to do. So this is the reason for reining in the size of the federal government. And he reasoned that the federal budget, well, he asked Secretary of the Treasury Gallatin, we'll get to Jefferson's appointees in a minute, how can we retire the federal debt within 4 presidential administrations, which he knew it would take at least that long, without raising taxes? In fact, Jefferson wanted to eliminate all internal taxes because he thought they were unconstitutional. Instead, rely on the tariff and on land sales. So He also knew that taxes were unpopular politically. And in his second inaugural address, I should point out, Jefferson pledges in his first term to begin the process of retiring the federal debt in 16 years without raising taxes. And in his second inaugural, eliminating taxes was actually a relatively easy thing to do. But if you're going to retire the debt without raising taxes, how can you do it? You're going to spend less. Yes, you're going to spend a lot less. So he asked Gallatin, how much would we have to pay in order to retire the debt in 16 years? And Gallatin looked at the principal and interest and thought, okay, $7.3 million per year would be what we would need to pay. Federal revenues were about $10 million per year from tariffs and land sales, $9.5 million in tariffs. So what does that leave for the operating budget of the federal government? About $2.7 million. Okay, so this will be the operating budget of the federal government. The rest will be devoted to retiring the debt because we have to do it in 16 years or in the space of 4 presidential administrations. And this will be a way to free succeeding generations from paying the debt we have incurred. Otherwise, it will never get paid. Okay, so the Adams administration spent about an operating budget of $3 million, which was quite limited. Jefferson is going to cut it even further. Okay, and I have to tell you, they succeeded in doing this. Not in 16 years, but in 20 years. And in the space of those 20 years, the country fought 2 wars, one against Tripoli and one against England, also purchased Louisiana, which we'll talk about later on, more than doubling the size of the country, and also endured an embargo and other things. So the administration sets the country on the path to retiring the debt for the purpose of leaving succeeding generations free to make their own decisions about how they wanted to live. Did it without raising taxes. In fact, in his second inaugural address, which I won't read to you, he asked, what farmer, what mechanic, what artisan ever sees the face of a tax collector of the United States? Jefferson was fond of these rhetorical questions which had only one answer, and in this case, none, because they didn't have to pay any taxes. Okay, so you eliminate what are seen as unnecessary things in the federal budget. For example, the Army is cut. The Navy is cut quite considerably. Jefferson has some kind of crazy ideas about the Navy. If you dismantle the ships, you don't have to maintain them, and then you can just put them back together if you ever need them, and you don't have to have all these guys waiting around for the ship to sail somewhere. Later on, he has this idea for small gunboats to defend things. Okay, cutting the apparatus of the federal bureaucracy, which wasn't that great. I mean, we would laugh at the size of the federal government in 1801, and even more perhaps at Jefferson's idea that this was bloated. So you're cutting what are seen as unnecessary positions and eliminating waste in government. Everyone, in my memory, I don't think there's ever been a president who hasn't talked about cutting waste in government, and I don't think anyone has ever actually done it for a variety of reasons. I'm not blaming them. So, so Jefferson, however, does. Now, he does see one pretty big way of cutting government spending, and this was by cutting back on the judiciary. You'll recall that in 1801, once they knew they were out of office, the Federalists in Congress passed a Judiciary Act, the Judiciary Act of 1801, which set up new judgeships around the country, circuit judges, district judges, and it spared the Supreme Court judges from the burden of riding circuit. The Congress in 1802 repeals it. And also Jefferson wants to, abolishing the judgeships that had been created in 1801. Is it constitutional, by the way, for Congress to abolish a judge's position?
I don't believe so.
Why not?
Because it's a separation between Congress can approve their pay.
Yeah. Congress can't reduce their pay,
Correct.
right? Actually, it says that. They can't reduce
their pay, and they can increase their pay.
They can increase their pay, but they can't reduce their pay, the Constitution says.
Oh, that's right, that's right.
Okay? Because they do want judicial independence. Is abolishing the position the same as reducing the pay? I mean, it has the same effect. Excuse me? No. So you would be with Jefferson on this. It's okay to abolish their position because it's not the same as, it doesn't say.
It's not the same thing. I don't know if you care with it. It's not the same. It's a loophole.
Yeah, it is. Okay. It is. It doesn't say you can't abolish the position. Yes?
But does the Constitution give the President the power to appoint the judges?
He does have the power to appoint judges.
Does he have the power to create positions?
No, Congress can create positions. Excuse me? Then they can also abolish them. Okay, that's what you would say. Good enough. There's also, so there is this issue about, of course, if you're a Federalist and you've been appointed to this judgeship and then it's removed from under you, you're going to say, no, this isn't constitutional. And if you're a Republican in Congress, you'll say, well, yes, it is, because it says we can't reduce your pay. We haven't reduced your pay. We've just eliminated your job. And also there are good reasons for reducing the size of the federal judiciary. And, you know, the Judiciary Act of 1801 said judges no longer have to ride circuit. This, of course, is good for the judges. The Republicans say that's actually bad because this means the judges will be isolated and won't know the rules throughout the country. We need to get them out there to see what's going on in the rest of the country, get to know the common law in each area. And the Judiciary Act of 1802 also puts off until 1803 the next meeting of the Supreme Court. You know, the Supreme Court, typically met every year. The Judiciary Act of 1802 says they don't need to meet again until 1803. Now, there's another issue circulating in this behind, the repeal of the Judiciary Act. In fact, before the repeal of the Judiciary Act or the creation of the new Judiciary Act comes into being, and that is this. I mentioned Congress creating these new positions, and President Adams, in February of 1801, had appointed people to these various positions in the federal judiciary. These were called midnight appointments. He knew he was leaving office, and so he appoints people who also had lost their jobs to various positions, justices of the peace, tax collectors, prosecutors that Adams appointed in February of 1801. Now, Jefferson thought that Adams should not have appointed anyone once he realized he was not going to be president anymore, that he should have let his successor do this. Was he right? Excuse me?
There are midnight laws, which are still standing today, which were actually used heavily.
Yeah.
Whether it's right or wrong, it's in his power.
Okay. So it's in his power to appoint people whether it's right or wrong, you're saying. So.
No, he didn't do anything wrong.
No, he didn't. No. No. In fact, Abigail Adams, Jefferson complains about this later on to Abigail Adams, saying, later on in life, Abigail Adams starts a correspondence with Jefferson, who had been a close friend earlier, and they unburden themselves about things they think the other one did wrong. And for Jefferson, this is one of the big things that Adams did wrong. He appointed all these people when he knew Jefferson was going to become president. Abigail says, Washington did the same thing. He appointed people before he left office. And also Abigail was mad because, as I said, Jefferson actually dismisses some people Adams had appointed, and one of the people he dismissed was John Quincy Adams, who had been appointed to a prosecutorial position in Boston. Bless you. Jefferson wasn't aware that he was on this list. He just got a list from the Republicans in Boston saying these are the people to appoint, not realizing there already was this list that John Quincy Adams' name was on. So anyway, not to get into personal feelings here, but the president does have this power, and just because he's going out of office doesn't mean he can't appoint people. But Jefferson thought Adams had carried it too far. Actually, one of the appointments I should mention is that of Chief Justice Marshall. And Marshall was Secretary of State in the Adams administration. And the story goes that Chief Justice Ellsworth, there was a time when I would have asked you, who was the Chief Justice in 1801? And who would have known Oliver Ellsworth? Okay. He retired from being Chief Justice. And Adams first he offered the position to John Jay, who turned it down. This is in like January of 1801, and Adams knows he's leaving office on March 4th. So he needs to appoint someone, and that person has to be confirmed by the Senate before noon on March 4th. So the clock is ticking here as Adams is writing letters to various people offering them the position of Chief Justice, and these folks turn him down. Then he has to find someone else, write to him, get that person to agree, get the Senate to confirm that person. We know how long the process takes now. It could take longer in 1801. Next candidate also turns him down. It's now toward the end of February, and the story goes that Secretary of State Marshall, bringing in the mail to President Adams, gives him this letter from the latest candidate for the Chief Justiceship, who has turned it down, and Adams reads the letter and says, "I suppose I must appoint you," which he does. So he appoints Secretary of State Marshall to be Chief Justice, and Marshall is confirmed. Now, Marshall continues to act as Secretary of State because Jefferson's designee to be Secretary of State. And who was Jefferson's Secretary of State? Someone whose name looms large in American constitutional history. James Madison. Hasn't come to Washington yet. His father died. He's wrapping up affairs back in Virginia, so he's not come. So Marshall is acting as Secretary of State until Madison gets to town. By the way, Madison and Marshall get along very well. Madison and Jefferson get along very well. Jefferson and Marshall hate each other. It's one of those things, you can try to figure this out if you want. Getting back to this whole problem of appointments, and I realize we're jumping around here. There are lots of things happening simultaneously here, and we'll get back to this particular problem of presidential what happens with the judiciary in a bit. In New Haven, Connecticut, speaking of getting lists of people to appoint to various positions, the President Adams had appointed a man named Elizur Goodrich to be collector of customs. Okay, and Goodrich had been a congressman, had been elected in 1798, and then he resigned in March of 1801 on being proffered the position of customs collector for the port of New Haven. Customs collectors are the most important federal appointees, patronage appointees in any place. They're responsible for counting all the money that comes in and charging the owners for the tariff duties and so on. So very important position here. And Elizur Goodrich had been a congressman. He was a Federalist, of course, and he resigned effective March 3rd, having been appointed customs collector on February 19th, 1801. Jefferson thinks that the appointment of Mr. Goodrich was null. That Adams could not have appointed him because Adams knew not only was Adams out of office then, knew he was out of office, he knew Jefferson was going to be president. Before then you could make the argument Adams wasn't sure if there was going to be a president after March 4th. After February 19th, the Congress had voted. Jefferson had been elected, so he should not have done this. And Jefferson considers Goodrich's appointment null, and instead he appoints a fellow named Samuel Bishop. And Bishop is also a politician, but he's a Republican. Connecticut at this time is a bastion of republicanism. It's probably the most federalism. Bastion of federalism. Jefferson's trying to encourage the Republicans in Connecticut. And so Samuel Bishop is the mayor of New Haven. He's also been a chief judge of the county court. He's a deacon in the Congregational Church. And his son is a guy named Abraham Bishop, who's a real player in Connecticut politics. And Abraham Bishop had delivered an oration in 1801 comparing Thomas Jefferson to Jesus Christ. So you can see how the bishop's star would burn brightly in the White House. And in the course of this oration, Abraham Bishop had said Connecticut would follow the bark of liberty only with the help of a tow rope. So these Republicans in Connecticut need help, and help comes in the form of an appointment of Samuel Bishop to be collector of customs in New Haven. And then he can appoint other Republicans to the customs office, the customs house in New Haven, and things would be great for Republicans in Connecticut. Right? Okay. The merchants of New Haven don't like this. They all liked Goodrich. And a group of merchants sent a petition to President Jefferson in which they claimed that they represented 7/8 of the merchants of New Haven. And they protested the removal of Goodrich and his replacement by Bishop, whom they said was incompetent. And he may very well have been. They said he could hardly write his name. He didn't know anything about accounting. And he was 77 years old. Not that they had anything against old guys, but they thought the real only reason he had been appointed was his son was this political player, and so Jefferson's giving out this patronage plum to the father of Abraham Bishop to appease him. Hard to believe that anyone would do something like this with an appointment so important as collector of New Haven, use it to reward a political ally. And they also said, in your inaugural address, you talked about restoring harmony and the rights of the minority. Well, how come then you're removing someone like Goodrich and replacing him with this boob? And Jefferson responded to this petition of the merchants of New Haven, saying, declarations by myself in favor of political tolerance, exhortations to harmony and affection in social intercourse, and to respect for the equal rights of the minority, have been quoted and misconstrued into assurances that the tenure of offices was to be undisturbed. But could candor apply such a construction? When it is considered that during the late administration, those who were not of a particular sect of politics were excluded from all offices, when by a steady pursuit of this measure, nearly all of the offices in the United States were monopolized by that sect, when the public sentiment at length declared itself and burst open the doors of honor and confidence to those whose opinions they more approved, was it to be imagined this monopoly of offices was to be continued in the hands of the minority? Does it violate their equal rights to assert some rights in the majority also? Is it political intolerance to claim a proportional share in the direction of public affairs? Can they not harmonize in society unless they have everything in their hands? Right? Isn't he right? They want to hold on to all the offices, and they say they can't harmonize unless they have everything. And they think that him saying we want harmony and affection means all of you who have jobs can keep them now, when in fact the majority of the people said they wanted someone else. If the will of the nation, manifested by various elections, calls for an administration of government according with the opinion of those elected, if for the fulfillment of that will displacements are necessary, he says it's best to begin with those appointed at the very last minute of the term. Right? So we're starting with people appointed late. Doesn't mean we're going to fire everybody, but these few we will. If due participation of office is a matter of right, how are vacancies to be obtained? Those by death are few, by resignation none. Jefferson said at another point that men who hold office for life never retire and seldom die. Okay? Can any other mode than that of removal be proposed? I lament sincerely that unessential differences of political opinion should ever have been deemed sufficient to interdict half the society from the rights and blessings of self-government, to proscribe them as characters unworthy of every trust. It would have been to me a circumstance of great relief had I found a moderate participation of office in the hands of the majority. I would gladly have left time and accident to raise them to their just share. But he has to take some action. And he says once this situation is corrected, his administration shall return with joy to that state of things when the only questions concerning a candidate shall be, is he honest? Is he capable? Is he faithful to the Constitution? So Bishop gets the post of collector of customs. Incidentally, Goodrich then was elected mayor of New Haven, and he was mayor of New Haven for the next 15 years. So I don't know. Don't know if it helps the Republicans in Connecticut, which was, of course, the intention. So Jefferson's not going to fire everyone Adams appointed. He is, however, going to cut where he can. Now, getting back to this business of, Marshall filling in as Secretary of State, one thing that happens on the night of March the 3rd is President Adams sat up late filling out commissions for various positions that the Federalists had created. And the Judiciary Act of 1801 created 42 justices of the peace for the District of Columbia. And President Adams appointed people to these various positions, which means each one had a commission, a document, by which the president appointed you to this position, okay? And then Secretary of State Marshall would affix the seal of the president to that, showing the commission has been signed and the commission has been sealed. And then Marshall left them on his desk and went to attend to other things. And Marshall was a lazy man. I'm not criticizing him. Lots of people I know are lazy, and they are pretty good people. So Marshall didn't get around to delivering these 42 commissions to these various guys who had been appointed justices of the peace in the District of Columbia. James Madison finally arrives in Washington to become Secretary of State. He finds this stack of commissions sitting on his desk, and he says to Jefferson, "What should I do with these?" And Jefferson says, 42 justices of the peace in the District of Columbia? No, it's a pretty small town. Why do we need that many justices of the peace? How about we say there will be 30 justices of the peace, looks at the list, 23 of these guys who had been appointed by Adams get to be justices of the peace. The other, Jefferson appoints 7 others, 30 justices of the peace, and that's about all you need. Okay. Now, word had gotten out to some of these characters who had been appointed justices of the peace that they had been appointed, but then they never got their commission. The original 42, or should I say the 19 on the list who did not get their appointments. And one of them is a fellow named William Marbury. And Marbury learns that, in fact, President Adams had signed his commission and Secretary of State Marshall had sealed the commission, and he believes then the commission is valid. Is the commission valid? Signed and sealed. There are 3 things you need to make it valid. Delivered. Signed, sealed, and delivered. Right? There's a song about that. It actually relates to this very case. Karen, you want to sing it? No. Signed, sealed, delivered. Okay. Good. Okay. So he wonders where it is. Finds out it never was delivered. And so he really wants to be a justice of the peace. So what should he do? Inquire about it. He inquires about it, finds out he's not going to get his commission. So then what should he do? Sue. Good. Okay. You're thinking like justices of the peace, I suppose. And so he goes to the Supreme Court. He sues Secretary of State Madison to deliver his commission. Or actually, he goes to court. He gets a lawyer named Charles Lee. Charles Lee had been a senator until he was voted out in 1800, and then he had been given a position as a federal judge. His judgeship had been eliminated when Jefferson had the Congress revoke the Judiciary Act. So Lee is now a lawyer, and he takes this case. He goes to the Supreme Court, and he asks Chief Justice Marshall to get a writ of mandamus, a writ from the court demanding that Secretary of State Marshall show cause why the court should not issue a writ of mandamus. You know, he doesn't just say, okay, Madison, you have to turn over the commission. You have to show cause why we should not demand that you turn over the commission. Okay, it's kind of a complicated legal thing. What should Madison do when Chief Justice Marshall says we need to show cause why we shouldn't issue a writ of mandamus? What would you do if you're Secretary of State Madison and this lawyer comes to you saying, you know, you had this commission for this guy to be a justice of the peace. You never delivered it. Why shouldn't the court issue a writ of mandamus demanding that you show cause why you should not have delivered this? What would you do if you were Secretary of State?
I want to tell the people that they're going to be justice of peace before I give the document.
No, you shouldn't have told. No one should have told him. But you know that bridge has been crossed. You can't retrace that step and say, okay, pretend you don't know this. Madison ignores it.
I was going to say ignore it.
Yeah, okay, that would have been the answer Madison would have given. He ignores it. You know, it's no one's business. What's the court going to do in this case? What's next? Suppose the court does issue a writ of mandamus then. What's Madison going to do? They've just said, show cause why we shouldn't issue a writ of mandamus. He ignores that. So then if the court takes the next step and issues the writ of mandamus, what do you suppose he's going to do? Excuse me?
Say they don't have any cause.
He might, or he might just ignore that. You know, Marshall realizes he's in a tough situation here. All because William Marbury wants to be a justice of the peace. Now he's putting the Supreme Court, which is stacked with these Federalists like Marshall, and Jefferson's been saying how they packed the judiciary with these guys who are against what the majority wants, putting the Supreme Court in a position of arguing with the executive branch. And Marshall understands how the system works. Which branch has more power? The executive, right? They control everything. And they're the ones who were elected. There had just been what Jefferson's calling this revolution. He keeps saying the majority have spoken. And the majority seem to really like President Jefferson. Who elected John Marshall? Who appointed him? John Adams. Guy got kicked out. And Jefferson's saying, you know, a lot of these appointments were illegitimate. And what gives them any legitimacy? So if Chief Justice Marshall issues a writ of mandamus and Madison ignores it, then what? Could he arrest Madison? I don't know if they had federal marshals. There are these justices of the peace running around Washington. Maybe you can get one of these 30 guys to go and arrest the Secretary of State. I suppose he could do that. What would happen then to Marshall? He'd lose his job. You know, he'd be impeached. He'd be kicked out. And if he does it, or if he does this and nothing happens, that's even worse. Because then it shows he can't do anything. And you know, Marshall was a politician. He had been a senator from Virginia, very smart guy, so he knew the position he was in here. And he knew, yeah, Marshall should probably have delivered the commission, but I don't know what I can do about it. Politically, could I tell Madison, okay, you ignored everything else I said, but now I really want you to turn the commission over? It's really a tough thing. And Marshall realizes that if the court gets into a fight with the elective branch, the court's going to lose. If the court gets into a fight with the branch that controls the military and so on, that executes the law, it's going to lose. As Hamilton had pointed this out in the Federalist, that this is the weakest branch. It has neither force nor will. Something that Marshall realized. And Marshall realizes how popular the administration is. You know, in 1802, in the congressional elections, more Federalists lose their job. He knows it's popular for the following reasons. Well, actually, the big reason, they've repealed all these taxes. And, you know, so that's going to make them quite popular. In fact, in his second annual message, Jefferson tells Congress there's nothing more to do. You know, you've cut all of the taxes that the previous administration imposed. You've scaled back the size of the federal government, put the debt on the path to being paid. Really not much else to do. It's, you read through the letters between Jefferson and his cabinet, and they believe this is a political millennium. Secretary of Treasury Hamilton wrote one note to Jefferson. One line in it is, "I hope that history will have little to say of your administration." Because your administration is going to eliminate the things that history is full of, like wars and, you know, grandeur and so on. It's going to scale back the size of the federal government, leave people free to regulate their own affairs, and what's historical about that? Nothing, really. So you've freed everybody. So Marshall realizes this, and he's really stuck. And the Supreme Court, as I said, the Judiciary Act of 1802 said no reason for the Supreme Court to meet at all this year. They reconvene in February of 1803. And Chief Justice Marshall has to issue a decision in this case of William Marbury versus James Madison. Well, Marbury wanted a writ of mandamus on Madison so he could get his commission as a justice of the peace. You know, it's not a great case, but it's really one of the few sitting before the court. In fact, the court up to this point had not sat together as a court. Each judge would issue his own opinions. Marshall insists they all do have to sit together as a court, and the court has to speak with one voice. So Marshall will read the opinion of the court in this case. And in many ways, it's the most important case in the history of the Supreme Court, also perhaps the most misunderstood. And we'll get to that in a minute for those of you who are interested in going to law school. Is anyone here actually a lawyer? You could probably tell us all about this case if you are. Okay. So Marshall begins the decision of the court with a lecture to the administration on how badly they have administered by failing to deliver the commission to William Marbury. William Marbury was entitled to his commission. He had been legally and rightfully appointed a justice of the peace for the District of Columbia, and the administration had refused to deliver it. And he was entitled, or he asked for a writ of mandamus in demanding that the administration turn over the commission. And he probably should have gotten one. But the court did not have the power to issue a writ of mandamus in this case. The Constitution set out the original jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. And according to the rules of law, issuing writs of mandamus was a power of an appellate court. Marbury had come to the Supreme Court first, so it was sitting as a court of original jurisdiction. And the Constitution in Article 3 says what the original jurisdiction of the court is. Issuing writs of mandamus is not an original power. However, the Judiciary Act of 1789, Section 13, had given the Supreme Court the power to issue writs of mandamus, but that violated the Constitution to do that. So, Section 13 of the Judiciary Act of 1789 is unconstitutional, and Mr. Marbury cannot get his commission because he came to the Supreme Court first. Is it clear to everyone what happened? What happened?
Established a judicial review from the Supreme Court over Congress.
Okay, yeah, but he established, okay, so if you're going to law school, the thing to remember, judicial review. The thing to remember if you're interested in history is judicial review wasn't the issue here. The issue was how do you establish the integrity of the Supreme Court when it's in a conflict with the political branches of government? And Marshall is walking a tightrope. And where did the Judiciary Act of 1789 come from here? I've mentioned the 1801 Act, the 1802 Act. I don't think anyone had thought about the Judiciary Act of 1789 since 1789, but Marshall pulls that out of a hat. In fact, does anyone know who wrote the Judiciary Act of 1789? Oliver Ellsworth, who later became Chief Justice. So that's unconstitutional. We'll come back to this in a minute after our break, so hold on to your hats and think about judicial review, poor William Marbury, and what is he going to do now?